Hi Year 13, hopefully by now you've started to plan your response. This lesson, which will take you through your independent study session and also period 5, is all about structuring your exam response. So remember that this lesson will take you over an hour to complete, but what I will ask is that at each stage you're really strict with the timings so that you can practice writing a timed response. So for this, you will need your planning sheet that you completed last lesson that covers all of the assessment objectives, and you will need your table that you completed last lesson that covers the 3 big ideas that are going to guide us through our essay. So as a reminder of the question that we're answering in today's lesson, I would like you to examine the presentation of the female experience in the texts that you have studied, remembering that the texts are Top Girls and Feminine Gospels as a collection, so you need to make reference to at least 2 poems. If you would like to, pause the video now and write down the question so that you have it at the top of your response. Off you go. Okay, one thing I wanted to cover, having read your essays that you did with me before Christmas, was how to write an introduction. So remember that we use the general specific thesis model to complete an introduction, and this allows us to be instantly comparative, to make a case, make a thesis that will allow us to address AO1 and to start to contextualise our texts. It's a really easy thing to do to, in your introduction, say something about your context, and then you get some of those easy marks for AO3. So we're going to start with our general statement, where you make a general statement about the theme. And I've given you a couple of sentence starters that might help you there. In modern literature, female characters, or the female experience is often. If you find those sentence structures limiting, feel free to use one of your own, but I want you to make a general statement about the female experience in modern literature, remembering that the title of this paper is Modern Times. Off you go. Okay, in your next sentence or 2 sentences, you're going to be more specific about the texts that we're studying. And here is where we're going to try and score those easy to achieve AO3 marks. So your job here is to contextualise the 2 texts. So you need to think about the big events going on at the time that the texts were written. You might want to think about legislation or political events. These are all the things that we discussed in our last lesson that we put down in our AO3 box. So obviously the biggest influence on Top Girls was Margaret Thatcher's election as Prime Minister, so the first female Prime Minister. We also looked at the legislation, the things like the Abortion Act, the Equal Pay Act, that led to the birth of the New Woman. And we can do this by writing about both texts in one here to be instantly comparative as well. Both Top Girls and Feminine Gospels were written after, and I'd like you to contextualise the texts about the various different things relating to the female experience at those times. I want you to spend no more than 1 minute really writing your sentence, so pause the video, copy and complete the sentence structure below, and I'd like everyone to use the same sentence structure. Off you go. And then the final part of our introduction will be our thesis statement. This statement is really important. It's important because it will set out the argument that you develop throughout your essay, and AO1 is focused around how you respond to a text. The thesis is an essential part of academic writing. It ensures that you're engaging with the texts critically, and you should summarise the big ideas about the female experience in this statement. And again, to ensure that we all write a successful thesis statement, and you guys are actually quite good at writing thesis statements as well, so this isn't something I am too worried about covering in great detail, but I'd like you to copy and complete the sentence in blue. It would therefore be easy to argue that, and then complete your sentence. Off you go. Okay, so as a reminder, the three big ideas that are going to drive our essay forward are, firstly, we will look at how history celebrates and favours male success. Then we will look at how females are those that suffer and endure. And then we're going to look at social expectations surrounding motherhood as a part of the female experience. So all three of those big idea statements link to the theme of the female experience. You've completed this table where you've already started to think about different parts of the text that you will focus in on. And just a reminder really to have that table in front of you as you go through this. So our first big idea then that we're all going to analyse together is this idea. History celebrates or favours male success. And what I've done is I've written your opening statement to examine this big idea for you, so we will all start with the same sentence. In modern literature, female writers have often examined the view that society, I'm going to start that sentence again because I went all wrong there. In modern literature, female writers have often examined the view that society traditionally favours stories of male success throughout history. So pause the video here and write that statement down as your opening statement. Off you go. Now what I'm going to do at each stage of your essay is I'm going to talk you through some ideas that you could use in your essay. I'm going to remind you of how to ensure that you cover all of the assessment objectives in your response. So when we write these comparative essays, what we do is we focus on one text first with our big idea, and then we link to the other text. Now, I think it's easier personally if we deal with Top Girls first as one complete text, and then we look to the poetry, because our poetry can be a little bit more flexible. We'll choose different poems for different questions and things like that. Okay, so what I want you to do is think about how in Top Girls, male success seems to be favoured more than female success. So parts of the text that stand out for me here are Mrs. Kidd's reaction to Marlene being promoted over Howard, and how society traditionally would have favoured Howard's promotion over Marlene. I think that's an interesting bit. Key quotations, we have things like "you're not natural," to show how society would think that a woman's natural role would be to be a mother within the domestic sphere, and how Marlene has deviated away from that. You might also want to look at Act 1 and the characters in Act 1 and how all of their success was tied to a male or a male identity in the case of Pope Joan. So choose your key part of the text. You're going to use a quotation to demonstrate your point, and then you'll analyse Churchill's methods. Remembering as well that what you want to do is weave in some contextual knowledge. So here you might talk about Margaret Thatcher defying expectations to become the first female Prime Minister, and how that allowed new opportunities for women. You could then look at how both writers were producing text during times when new opportunities for women were available, and use that as your link to Sub. So in Sub, there's a lot of talk of how she has to stand in for a man at various different points. But I think the part about the moon landing is particularly interesting here, especially how Duffy changed the line. It was one small step for man to it was one small step for a man. Again, here you're going to want to weave in some context. You could talk about Duffy's own success in her lifetime as the first female poet laureate. And after you've written your paragraph about Duffy and about how she demonstrates how society traditionally favours stories of male success through Sub, what you then want to do is make a comparative sentence that links back to your thesis. And you can do that Using the sentence starter below, therefore both Duffy and Churchill present that females throughout history have suffered because... Okay, I'd like you to spend 15 minutes, and remember I want you to be strict with yourself on timescales here. So set a timer and spend 15 minutes writing a response to that big idea. So this will form your first analytical point. Off you go. Okay then, so moving on to our next big idea. As a reminder, our next big idea was females are those that traditionally suffer and endure. Now you have written an essay under this title before, so you might like to bring in some of the ideas that you used for that one. Again, I've written our opening statement for us, so you might want to pause the video here and write it down onto your essay. Both writers examine the idea that suffering is an inherent part of the female experience. So as you can see there from your AO4 box, where you've been quite comparative, and you've written those 3 comparative statements, there we have somewhere where you've been explicitly comparative and the examiner can give you marks for assessment objective 4. Again, we're going to take on a similar structure. We're going to look at Top Girls first and how females seem to suffer and endure in Top Girls. Then you're going to use Sub and talk about how females suffer and endure in Sub. And then you're going to try and link to another of Duffy's poems. You might remember me saying that I personally would choose The Long Queen. You might have chosen something different, and that's fine as well. In terms of contextual knowledge that I think would be interesting here, anything about the life and times of the women in Act 1, because undoubtedly all of them are united by the fact that they suffer, and the fact that Churchill uses women from different periods in history, from literature, from art, shows that suffering is a universal experience for these women. That although things have moved on, you can absolutely still see that it's part of the female experience. And at that point as well, it might be a nice time to bring in information about that being a non-naturalistic technique and therefore a feature of postmodern theatre. That would be another thing that would give you marks for AO3. But I also think it would be quite interesting here to weave in a critical analysis of that, offer a critical perspective. So what do you think a structuralist critic would say? I think that they would say that we're able to draw comparisons and contrasts between the women coming from different time periods, but ultimately by looking at them all as part of a wider structure, we can see that suffering and endurance is part of the female experience. Okay, in terms of Sub and the Long Queen, if you were to look at the Long Queen, we can see that suffering and endurance happens within the female experience in relation to the female body. So in Sub, she makes references to the parts of her female body that some males have used as an excuse to hold women back. So periods, for instance, pregnancy, etc. And in the Long Queen as well, how she talks about tears being one of the laws of the Long Queen. That definitely shows that suffering seems to be an inherent part of the female experience. Again, after you've made those comparisons, after you've brought in your AO3 and your AO5, what you're going to want to do is make another link back to your thesis. Okay, so I've put the same one on there as before, but you're going to need to adapt it to this big idea that females are those that suffer and endure. So again, spend 15 minutes writing your paragraph, be strict with timings, off you go. And our final big idea that we're going to examine before we finish our essay is that is about social expectations surrounding motherhood. So we have discussed how, particularly in Top Girls, society seems to present women with a choice, Now, modern society presents women with a choice. In older societies, they didn't have a choice at all. They had to be a mother, and that was it. But in modern societies, women seem to have to choose between being a mother and pursuing a successful career. And both writers are quite critical of that idea, that once a woman reaches motherhood, they have to give up their career. So again, I've written our opening statement, which you might like to pause the video and write down. Both writers are critical of society's expectations of women and motherhood. Again, you're going to analyse your evidence from Top Girls, then analyse your evidence from Sub, and link to another of Duffy's poems. In terms of interesting contextual knowledge, I think this is the point at which you should start to talk about how both writers, both Churchill and Duffy, both managed to balance successful writing careers with motherhood, and therefore they both defied society's expectations, which clearly positions them to be critical of how society seems to want women to make a choice between the two. You could also look at the life and times of the women in Act 1, because Churchill shows that in the past, women had to change their career after motherhood. And you could think about whether Marlene has to change her career after motherhood, or whether she has to make a choice between motherhood and a career, and bring that in as well. Again, it might be nice here to offer a feminist perspective on this. What would a feminist say about society's expectations of women and motherhood? And then finally, at the end again, make sure you make that comparative sentence where you link back to your thesis. 15 minutes then, set a timer, off you go. Finally then, our conclusion. Lots of you have asked me before how to write a conclusion, and this is how I would like you to structure it. So at this point, I'd like you to read your thesis statement again. That's going to be really important because your conclusion is going to be a concise answer to the argument that you set up in your opening paragraph. So highlight your thesis statement to make sure it's really clear there for you to see. And your job here is to summarise your findings in relation to the question and your thesis. You will start with an overall, both Churchill and Duffy, what do they show about the female experience? And then you're going to summarise how they show this. Okay, both writers do this by. And then finally your sentence will, your conclusion will end with a therefore. So we have an overall, then you summarise, then we do a therefore. Therefore, modern writers, showing you know this is an essay about modern times. Therefore, modern writers present the idea that, what is the biggest idea that you learn about the female experience? Spend 5 minutes on your conclusion, and then I would like you to submit your work to me. I'm happy to accept a photo or a typed essay, whatever's easiest for you, and I'll give you personal feedback on your work. Okay, off you go.